This is Rick Levine with your December mid-month update, and I know that this is later than usual. However, I did clearly state at the December forecast, which I recorded when I was in India, that because of the difficult circumstances of that recording, that I would do an in-depth end of the month, but it would be late. I wanted to do it when I returned home here to Seattle. Yesterday was my first full day back in Seattle, and I gave that over to jet lag. This is Thursday, December 19th. And I am recording this for the last week or so, week and a half of the month of December. And also, as I said that I would do in the December forecast, I am also going to talk about the year ahead, just in generalities. And for those of you who want a deeper dive on that, there are a number of places where that will be available. Including Astrology Night at Soul Food Coffee House here in Redmond, Washington. And the next one will be on Friday evening, January 3rd. Of course, I will do the January 1st update timely, but on January 3rd at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, I will be focusing that evening on a more in-depth dive into the year ahead. I'm going to apologize in advance for my voice. I had a bit of a cough and lung infection in India, and I'm still recovering from it, so my voice might sound a little strange, and I might actually cough, so just bear with me. It'll probably sound worse to you than it feels to me. So, it's important to understand that we are certainly at a turning point in December. We've already seen this begin to unfold, really October, November. Certainly November was a big turning point, and on through December, and next year will continue accordingly. I'll get to the day by day for the rest of December and a look ahead in just a moment. But because this is a public video, meaning this is going out to everyone, normally my mid-month updates only go out to Patreon subscribers. But because it's going out to everyone, I do want to spend a few minutes in talking about what's coming up for the month ahead. Remember, if you're not interested in any of these events or any of these potential events, but whether they be online or in person, you're welcome to scroll ahead, but this is my chance to reach you, and I know many of you want to know what's going on, obviously, because many of you attend these functions. I already mentioned Astrology Night at Soul Food, and I'll mention that again on the January 1st recording. That'll be on January 3rd at 6:30 p.m. here in Seattle. And for those of you in the Seattle area, you're welcome to come by. For those of you anywhere else on the planet, it will be live streamed as usual on YouTube. I'd like also to make sure that you know that there is still early pricing for the course that I'm teaching at Kepler College beginning January 12th. This is the same course that I taught last summer. It'll be a round 2 version of this for those of you who are unable to schedule or unable to take it for whatever reason. This is an introduction to harmonic aspects, one of my favorite topics in astrology, and I'll be teaching an in-depth, it's a 5-week course on the theoretical basis and the evolution of the use of aspects in astrology. And I'll be presenting harmonic aspects in a very practical and usable framework. Harmonic aspects are aspects that are based upon divisions of the circle other than 12. Normally, we divide a circle by 1 and get conjunctions, 2 and get oppositions, 3 and get trines, 4 and get squares, and then 6 and we get sextiles. But we'll be looking at the aspects dividing a circle by 5, that's the quintile series, 7, the septiles, 8, the octiles, 9, the noviles, 10, which is really connected to the quintiles because that's half of 5, the deciles, and 11, the 11 tiles or elf tiles. So if you're interested in this, check out the page. The links on all of these things will be contained in in clickable links that will be in pinned comments below. It'll be in the first comment, and they'll be all there for you. And that will be through Kepler College, and that will be an introduction to harmonic aspects, 5 weeks beginning Sunday, January 12th at noon Seattle time. Also, in January, I will be the featured speaker at the Washington State Astrological Association. These are monthly meetings held near Gasworks Park for those of you who live in the Seattle area. And there will be a Thursday evening lecture on January 9th at 7 p.m. The title of that lecture is There Are No Bad Charts, There Are No Bad Aspects, and There Are No Bad Transits. That'll be Thursday evening, January 9th. For those of you in Seattle, I believe it will also be available virtually for those of you who are not in the area. On the following Saturday, also part of the WASA, the Washington State Astrological Association weekend, I will be doing a Saturday workshop on January 11th from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And this will be a deep dive into working with aspects. For those of you who don't want to commit to a 5-week course at Kepler College for the in-depth version, this will still be a deeper dive than an hour lecture. We'll be working with charts of participants in the class, and we'll be integrating harmonic aspects in natal chart interpretation. Now, I would like to also announce a special Valentine's Day weekend event that's going to be in Southern California at a magical venue just a little bit north of Santa Barbara in Southern California, actually in Buellton, just off the 101. And this is going to be a special Valentine's Day weekend event called Bringing the Stars Down to Earth. And this will be a Friday night event that will be open to all, and an all-day Saturday event. If you wish, you can attend just one event or the other, the Friday night or the Saturday. There'll be special pricing for those of you who want to attend Friday night and Saturday. This is being sponsored by Heaven and Earth Workshops. That's the same people who sponsor my international workshops, including my workshops that I've done in Mexico and Bali and in Goa, India. The link for that also will be down below, and there will be information on that link, not only on the cost, but also on lodging if you're looking to stay in the area, if you're coming from out of town and flying into either LA or Santa Barbara. And the Friday night event will be called Starstruck, and since it's on Valentine's Day, it'll be a look at the astrology of relationships. And that event will be on Friday evening. You can come early at 5 o'clock for wine, snacks, and a sunset mixer. But the event itself will be from 6 to 8:30 p.m. And then on Saturday, we'll be doing one of my other favorite topics, which is working with the planets in your pocket, playing with the planets in your pocket. And this is about how we can enchant our lives with astrology, whether you're an advanced astrologer or astrology student, or even someone who's a beginner. This is going to be entertaining, enlightening. It's going to be a fun event. And whatever your level of astrological knowledge is, this workshop can help you understand the archetypal power of working with the planets that are always available to us, regardless of what our sign is. Then, March 7th through March 9th, I'll be at Convergence 2025. I've spoken about this before. I'm not going to say a lot more about it now, other than there'll be 24 speakers from around the world, and that will be in Orlando and sponsored by Cosmic Patterns. And the link for that is cosmicpatternsconference.com. Again, the clickable link will be down below. On May 9th through May 12th, I will be a featured speaker and do a pre-conference workshop for the 4th International Portuguese Astrology Conference in Porto, Portugal. The 3rd Portuguese astrology conference that I've spoken at, and I've enjoyed the other 2 thoroughly. There are English-speaking tracks, so if you do not speak Portuguese, you are certainly welcome. But it is the largest Portuguese language astrology conference in the world, and I look forward to seeing some of you there. Also, before I get to the actual material, I just want to also announce that I will be back in Goa for the last initiation into astrology. That'll be 2025, November 20th through December 2nd. It's not too early to think about that because this will most likely fill up. And I've been doing this similar workshop called an initiation into astrology for intermediate and beginners mostly. But starting in 2026, by popular demand or request, I'm going to be doing a more advanced workshop in Goa. So if you're interested in the initiation to astrology, again, regardless of your level of astrological interest or study, there'll be plenty of information, including a day-by-day curriculum on this, for this, at Heaven and Earth Workshops, heavenandearthworkshops.com. And that will be November 20th through December 2nd in 2025. So that's it, and thank you for this opportunity to allow me to share with you some of my upcoming events. And now on to the astrology of the remaining part of December and an overview of January and on through 2025. So the energy for December already has been incredibly potent. Everybody who's into astrology has been talking about what an inflection point that we are in. It's not just about the now in the past presidential election here in the United States, but it's really a transition of whatever it was that went on in the early 20 teens, 2012 through 2015, when we had so many things come back up, including issues around civil rights, around power. There were demonstrations, the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street in the United States. There was movement around gender issues of gay marriage and transgender issues that were up. Certainly civil rights, I think I already mentioned, environmental issues. There were issues around the use of pharmaceuticals and or plant medicine for consciousness altering, whether it be recreational or medicinal. All of these things in the 2020 teens, but 2012 through 2015 were very significant. And then obviously in the 2020-21 period of time, when we had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and the Jupiter-Saturn and the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions, all in a string of events that kind of corresponded with what became not only the year of the quarantine or the first year of the quarantine, COVID-19, and also the rise of the Black Lives Matter and again civil rights all over, and just issues that were just coming up really, really strong in 2020, 2021, even into 2022. And by the time we reach 2024, we're really at a turning point. But the larger sweep of events is really going to still include 2025, 6, 7, and really into 2028. Now, I know this is a larger sweep than we're going to be talking about for the next few minutes, but I just want to put this into perspective so that we understand that what's going on now is still a fractal in a much larger and more complex sequence of issues that will take time to unfold. It might feel like there have been changes made that are what's the word I'm looking for? That are set in stone, that are done. And that is very far from the truth. We are still in a very fluid state. And there are wide swings of energy right now that are partly explainable or consistent with the ongoing squares between Jupiter and Saturn. And this Jupiter-Saturn square scenario actually has been in play through 2024 and will stay in play really all the way through mid-2025. However, the second of the three exact squares between expansive Jupiter and contractive Saturn is on Christmas Eve Day, December 24th. So it falls within the next few days, and we're already certainly within the intensity of this expression. In order to understand the remaining days, weeks, days of the month of December 2024, and for that matter, the end of 2024 itself, we really need to go back to the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, when we had the once every 20-year conjunction between Jupiter, the planet of opportunity, the planet of making things bigger, the planet of expansion, and Saturn, the hard worker, the taskmaster, the planet of contraction and making things real. That every 20 years Jupiter and Saturn align. They did so in 1900, 1920, 40, 60, 80, 2000, actually it was early 2001, and again in 2020. It was December of 2020, actually. And the conjunction in December of 2020 was a special one because it was part of what's a larger cycle that astrologers call the grand mutation cycle, when the conjunctions actually change element. I'm not going to say more about that right now. But halfway between the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 2020 and the Jupiter-Saturn opposition in 2030. In 2024 into 2025, we have that halfway point, like a first quarter moon between a new moon and a full moon. This is actually the Jupiter making its square with Saturn, where there is a direct conflict between this idea of expanding energy, this idea of opening our minds, this idea of everything's going to be okay, of optimism, of opportunity. Jupiter in some ways is associated with the liberal idea of everything will be okay if everyone takes care of everyone. Jupiter is basically a good news planet, allegedly, but remember that too much of anything, even something that is tonic, is toxic. And this is the problem with too much Jupiter, too much expansion, is that it in itself can be very, very seriously problematic. On the other hand, we have Jupiter in dynamic conflict, in square with Saturn, which is the planet of contraction, the planet of crystallization. Jupiter expands things while Saturn pulls energy in. When energy's pulled in towards the center, that's when things get real. That's when things crystallize. That's when things become form and become a reality, or we might say the illusion of reality, because what's real isn't necessarily what we think is real. That's another story that we'll save for another day. But what's important is that Jupiter and Saturn made the first of three exact squares in mid-August, as the presidential election in the United States was beginning to take form and beginning to heat up in all of its complications. The second of these two conflicts, of these two squares, is on Christmas Eve Day, on December 24th, when we get to look at some of these same issues of what's going to work? What's the opportunities? What's the big? What's the expansive? How are we going to move out of our current condition and make things better into what's the hard work that we have to do? How are we going to pull in? How are we going to go back? How are we going to hold on to the status quo? How are we going to make things maybe the way we thought they were when we thought they were better than they are now? And this is coming to another round of dynamic conflict as we move toward the end of the year with the exact Jupiter-Saturn square 2 out of 3 that will be on December 24th. However, remember, this process of grow, contract, of liberal, conservative, of grow, tighten the tension on things and make things work the way they are. Move things out. It's yin, which is actually expansive, and yang, which is contractive. It's in some ways the female male, and I don't mean that from a sex standpoint. I mean it from a gender point of view of the expansion and contraction. The third and final Jupiter-Saturn square occurs on June 15th, 2025. So, in some way, it's going to take all the way through the middle of summer, all the way through the end of spring, actually, June 15th, but we may not feel it fully until the middle of summer, until July and August, that we can look back and we can see what this dance between this make things better, make things worse, make things bigger, make things smaller, dream pie in the sky, anything is possible. Jupiter, what's the hard work, and now how do we have to deal with the realities that we've created? This is the background dance of what's occurring, and it's basically very, very obvious in many ways right now, and it's part of the difficulties that we are facing. On top of that, we also have to realize that Pluto has moved into Aquarius. Not going to talk a whole lot about that right now. We have 19 years ahead of us to talk about to talk about Pluto in Aquarius. But what's important is that we're now moving into, or moved into, new ground, and there's no going back. And the new ground that we are moving into already is just a taste of what will be happening over the year and couple of years ahead, because although Pluto has just moved permanently, I say permanently for the next couple of decades anyhow, Pluto has moved into Aquarius. But starting next year, we're going to get a wave of other planets that are changing signs, slow-moving planets, like Saturn moving into Aries in May, and actually Neptune will move into Aries at the very end of March. So we have Neptune and Saturn moving from Pisces into Aries, pushing things into new realms, and I'll have a lot more to say about that as we talk more about 2025 in the deeper dives, both at the Astrology night on January 3rd, and certainly when we look at how this unfolds throughout 2025. On top of that, we also have Uranus tipping into Gemini in July of next year. And so between Pluto having moved into Aquarius, Neptune moving into Aries, Uranus moving into Gemini, and Saturn moving into Aries, we basically have the four outermost planets all changing signs or having just changed signs, indicating a whole new environment in which we will be living. Can't overstate this because it's that big of a deal. And yet, as we come back to where we are right now, here on the evening of December 19th, we have some other things cooking, and I want to focus on the day by day that's going to bring us up to the end of the month and then the beginning of January and how things will unfold then. So, first of all, we need to talk about Mercury because Mercury has been retrograde. Mercury went into its shadow back in Mercury turned retrograde back on November 25th, but it really entered its shadow back in the beginning of November, very close to Election Day. It was actually on November 7th. And so in a way, by the time that Mercury turned direct on December 15, just a few days ago, also very close to the December 15th full moon, as Mercury turned direct, we had pulled back as far as we could with Mercury, and now Mercury is moving forward again. And as Mercury moves forward throughout the rest of this month, it's going to reconnect with some of the aspects that it already made. And some of those aspects were not easy aspects, and I still think they're not going to be easy again. For example, Mercury squared Saturn. This is the week of Election Day. Actually, it was on November 12th. Mercury squared Saturn. And when Mercury squares Saturn, we need to deal with harsh realities. Our thinking needs to be readjusted based upon what we now know, but based upon what we thought we knew before. When Mercury went retrograde, it made its second of 3 squares with Saturn back at the beginning of December. And on December 26th, Mercury makes its third and final square with Saturn. But remember, on the 24th, Jupiter is going to be making an exact square with Saturn. So what that means is that as Mercury is making its third and final square with Saturn, it's also going to be opposing Jupiter on the 26th. Now, we'll get to that chart in just a moment, but I'm trying to give you the lay of the land here because Mercury squared Saturn on November 12th, and then it opposed Jupiter on November 18th. This is how big the change in thinking actually is, and this is how fast we're now moving into whatever new realm we're moving into. Then on December 4th and the 6th, retrograde Mercury repeated those two aspects. And now coming up on the 26th, on Boxing Day actually, Mercury will make its third and final square with Saturn, opposition with Jupiter. And then on the 28th, it'll make a half square with Pluto and a square and a half with Mars. And that will exacerbate an ongoing half square between Mars and Pluto, which I will also talk about more in just a moment. This is all very, very complicated dynamics that are not easy to move through. And I think that as we get closer to the new year and even through the beginning of January, we're going to see these events being played out in ways that, again, I can't quite imagine. I can only imagine the dynamics. But I do want to talk about that Mercury half square to Pluto, which is exact on December 28th, because I want to go back a moment and I want to talk about the fact that Saturn made a half square to Pluto back on May 6th. Then when they retrograded, the second of those 3 half squares was exact on September 25th, and the third and final half square between Saturn and Pluto will be the week after inauguration. That'll be on January 26th, 2025. Now, the reason why this is so important even in December is that Well, first of all, Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, squares, oppositions, half squares, and sesqui-squares are often related to boundary issues and in particular as fueled by ideological or religious conflict. In fact, we can look at the unfolding conflict in the Middle East between the Christians, Jews, and the Muslims for for well over 1,000 years, and we can see how those correspond to these aspects. In recent times, however, it was the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1947, actually, that was the beginning of the most modern dynamic shift in this unfolding scenario that resulted in the formation of Israel in 1948. But going back to bringing this up to date more, and by the way, at the most recent Saturn-Pluto opposition in 1982, that was corresponded with Israel's invasion of Lebanon. And more recently, at the Saturn semi-square to Pluto on on May 6th of 2024, most recently, that corresponded with Israel's first major incursion into Rafah, military incursion. And then on the second semi-square on September 25th, that was very closely tied to the pager explosions and another round of offensive of villages, aerial bombings in southern Lebanon. And again, the third and final semi-square will be at the end of January 26th. Now, the reason why this is so important in December is that through this, Mercury has also squared Saturn and made half squares with Pluto. Remember, we're talking about a Saturn-Pluto half square that is setting the background to this, but that on December 4th and 5th and 6th, Mercury was very active in that opposition to Jupiter, semi-square to Pluto, and square to Saturn, as it will be again on December 26th, 27th, 28th, and 29th, when Mercury makes a square to Saturn, an opposition to Jupiter, a half square to Pluto, and a square and a half to Mars. And this is all incredibly dynamic energy, and we'll just have to wait and see how this unfolds. But I'm hoping, because during this period of time, while Mars is retrograde, and we'll say more about Mars retrograde in just a moment, tempers flare. When a planet's retrograde, it's closer to Earth than it is at other times. Mars in the sky is quite red right now because it is in its it is close to its opposition. It's still nearing it to the sun, and as such, Mars is brighter in the sky, closer to Earth, which means that we tend to feel anger more. We tend to feel the need to defend our boundaries or to push our assert ourselves even into other people's boundaries because we might fear that our boundaries are being threatened. And so this is quite a dynamic period. And in order to understand this last part of December, even though the retrograde Mars is actually repeating an aspect that it made back around Election Day on November 3rd, Mars opposed Pluto, and this ties into all of this. Is like we're looking here at Saturn and Pluto. We're looking at Jupiter and Saturn, and we're looking at Mars and Pluto now. And on November 3rd, Mars opposed Pluto. And of course, that was so closely tied again to the election. And Mars opposing Pluto is often related to a release of unexplored, unknown, deep plutonic energies that are suppressed or repressed, are in the hidden realms, the hell realms. Remember, hell is simply a place where things are not known, they're not on the surface. And Mars's opposition to Pluto, which was exact on November 3rd, is, now that Mars is retrograding back toward that same opposition, it's not exact until January 3rd. But even as we approach the end of December, it will be getting closer and closer, while Mercury is making these exact aspects to Mars and to Pluto, kind of bringing this energy up even stronger, even though it may not play through until after not only the second opposition in January, on January 3rd, and the days following that, but the third and final opposition won't be until April 27th, 2025. Now remember, we have Mars opposing Pluto for the final time late April, and we have Jupiter squaring Saturn for the third and final time mid-June. And there are other aspects moving in there that are suggesting that whatever it is that's going on now is more complicated than it seems. And all I can think of is the Bob Dylan song, The Times They Are Changing, where he says, "Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, you better write now because the wheel's still in spin, but don't write too soon for the wheel's still in spin. There's no telling who that it's naming." And basically Dylan goes on to say that everything will change. The past and the present are still not known. And so there's this dynamic sense of, we may think that we know what's going on right now, but it's going to take time for it to unfold. Okay, so now let's bring our attention back to the chart of December 19th. So here at noon on December 19th, we can see that the moon is at 23, almost 24 degrees of Leo. And just as a point of reference, I'm using an Aries rising chart because we are all over the planet, and the rising sign and therefore the houses are dependent upon your location. But at noon on Thursday, December 19th, the moon is at 23 degrees Leo and 57 minutes, almost 24 degrees. I'll often round off the degrees as I'm talking, but it's important to note here that today, and whenever I say today, it's important to know that I'm specifically referring to the chart that we are looking at, unless I note otherwise. But today, on December 19th, we do have Venus making a trine with Jupiter. And this Venus trine Jupiter might feel like a bit of a respite in an otherwise complicated period of time. Maybe we're feeling a little bit of the holiday rush or the season of that energy. There's other stuff that is pushing that is quite strong. Also, as the moon is moving through Leo, it's making trines with planets in Aries, Chiron, and Eris at late Aries, and then the sun at late Sagittarius. But it's important to note that by evening time on today, December 19th, that the moon will move into Virgo at 11:36 p.m. So if we move the chart ahead to December 20th, that's Friday, December 20th, we can see at noon the moon is already at 6 degrees of Virgo. And on the 20th, there's no exact aspects to report, except notice how close the Jupiter retrograde is getting to the Saturn in Pisces. Jupiter at 14.5 degrees of Gemini is backing up into Saturn at 13 and roughly 3/4 degrees moving forward, Saturn moving forward. And so we're definitely feeling this push-pull energy that becomes exact over the next few days. We'll watch that Jupiter and Saturn grow closer day by day. The other thing that is of significance is that the sun midday on December 20th is at 29 degrees and 26 minutes. That's almost 29 degrees and 30 minutes, which is almost 29 and a half degrees of Sagittarius. The sun moves a little bit less than 1 degree every day from Earth's point of view, which means that by the time we move to December 21st, the sun is in Capricorn. And in fact, the sun enters Capricorn at 1:20 a.m. on December 21st in Seattle, which means that for many people it will happen on the 20th. And for many people, it won't happen until later in the morning. But the actual winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, summer solstice in the southern hemisphere occurs at 1:20 a.m. December 21st. And this is, of course, the moment that the sun moves into the sign of Capricorn from Earth's point of view. And this is the beginning of the season of winter, 4 seasons of year represented by Mercury going around the sun 4 times a year. And the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere is also the deepest of the nights. It's the longest nights. It's the origin of the timing of the year of not only the winter solstice, the Yuletide, the Christmas light, and the potential of the Christmas star, which actually was very likely a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Pisces. But in many ways, the Star of Bethlehem represents, regardless of what religious tradition you might have, it represents the potential of something that is at the beginning. It's the newborn. It's the hope of the future. It's the coming of the light, because even though the winter solstice is the darkest moment of the year, it is also the beginning of the return of the light. And we say the light, that's the light of awareness, the light of consciousness. It's the illumination of gold. It's the transmutation of base reality led into divine reality, the sunlight. And so this is a very important moment in the big sweep of things in our calendar. And on the 21st, we also have, we note that the sun, as it's moving into Capricorn at the moment of the solstice, it's also making a half of a sextile, a semi-sextile, which we don't use that often in mundane work. But there is an energetic complexity when 2 planets are in signs next to each other and by exact degree. And so we have the structure and the stability and the authority of what's happening with the sun in Capricorn tied to the transmutation of energy, the reformation or reformation of that which was into that which will be over the years ahead as Pluto continues its motion. As we move ahead, the moon moves through Virgo. On the 22nd, the moon is moving from Virgo into Libra. It does that late morning, so we can see here that by noon on the 22nd, the moon is already at 0.5 degrees, 0 degrees, 26 minutes of Libra. And we may feel the focus easing a little bit, and we may be kind of coming into a place where we want to be more forgiving, more open. But it's complicated because this is the 3rd quarter moon, and so there there is a bit of a conflict again between the idea of wanting things to be in balance and harmonious and celebrating, and yet we're also getting a trine from the moon to Pluto, and that trine from the moon to Pluto is important because it gives us a sense of the depth and the power that we can find when we are able to get beyond the surface material. The actual moment of the moon's trine to Pluto on the 22nd, it occurs at just after noon at 12:43 p.m., and then the square to the sun is at 2:18 p.m. So we kind of go from this juxtaposition of maybe really wanting everything to be okay and everything really moving in a direction that works, and then a bit of an abrupt need to do a reality check and remember, meanwhile, the Jupiter square Saturn is getting closer and closer. By the time we get to the 23rd, we can see that the moon is still moving through Libra. In fact, it's making a trine with Jupiter, and that trine with Jupiter is actually mid-afternoon on the 23rd. And again, this may cause an easing of complexity of energy. We're also getting a little bit of a potential positive pull from Venus making a sextile, and Venus making a sextile with Chiron, giving us the ability to maybe see through some of the apparent conflicts and go to a place where we're actually looking to heal or to soothe energies. But look at the Jupiter square Saturn now. Jupiter at 14 degrees and barely 9 minutes of Gemini, and Saturn at just 3 minutes away from being at 14 degrees of Pisces. And so we have Jupiter squaring Saturn now at 12 minutes of orb. That means it's 1/5 of a degree from being exact. These planets are moving slowly, but this is really the definer of what's going on. And the conflict between the hope and the potential and what could be good and the pressure of what is and what looks like is closing down and pulling in. It's the openness of Jupiter and the closedness of Saturn that are basically in conflict. And remember, though, this is only the second of 3 of these Jupiter-Saturn squares. That's on the 23rd. As we move to the 24th, that's obviously Christmas Eve. We can see that the Jupiter-Saturn square is now exact. The Jupiter square to Saturn, midday on the 24th, Jupiter is at 14 degrees 2 minutes of Gemini, and Saturn is at 14 degrees and 1 minute of Pisces. That square is exact at 1:59 p.m., but this is such a slow-moving and powerful square that in a way we're in the throes of this dynamic opportunity versus hard work, expansion versus contraction, hope versus hope of what is possible versus the reality of what is. These dynamic conflicts, remember, are a complex energy that is with us from last fall all the way through next late spring. And so this is a very long-term cycle, but we're feeling it right now. And maybe we're feeling it because on Christmas, many people are seeing the potential and the hope and the possibilities of what's ahead, and it may not be matching up exactly with what many of us are feeling on a day-to-day basis right now. As we move ahead Another day, this is on the 24th. By the time we get to the 25th, the moon actually moves into Scorpio, and it does that just after midnight on the 25th. So it is basically, depending on where you are, it's either late Christmas Eve or very early on Christmas Day morning that the moon moves into Scorpio. The energy becomes more intense. We become more passionate. As the moon moves into Scorpio, again, just after midnight, it's going to be squaring Pluto. And then just a few hours later, it's going to be squaring Mars, because look, Mars is getting retrograde. Mars is getting closer and closer to its opposition to Pluto. Remember, Mars already has opposed Pluto back in November. I think November 3rd it was. And as Mars retrogrades back into its exact opposition to Pluto again, it will perfect that exactly on January 3rd, I think I said. Let me just check my date here. I got too many dates cooking. On January 3rd. And so here, as the moon squares Pluto and Mars, this is another layer of discomfort. And on top of that, we also have Mercury now moving direct. And I mentioned these earlier before we were looking at charts, that Mercury moving direct will oppose Jupiter and square Saturn. And its opposition to Jupiter is exact on the 26th. That would be tomorrow from this chart on the 25th. And it will square Saturn on the 26th later in the day. Let's move this ahead to the 26th. And we can see now that the moon has moved out of that square with Pluto and Mars. But Mercury is now opposed Jupiter and coming into the square to Saturn. The Mercury opposition to Jupiter on Thursday, the 26th, on Boxing Day, that opposition is exact at 2:47 p.m., but Mercury squares Saturn exactly at 11:28 p.m., and so we're getting this make it big, think opportunity, think expansion, overthink, exaggerate, say too much. Whoops, said too much. Better pull in. This is the Mercury square Saturn now. What I said wasn't true. What someone told me was an exaggeration. I need to get real. You see, we're having this balance between the Jupiter and Saturn, even though that aspect is now separating. It's about 1/3 of a degree from being exact, because retrograde Jupiter is moving away from its exact square to Saturn, and it will continue to do so. But remember, we still have that third and final square between Jupiter and Saturn that will be exact on June 15th coming up. So this energy, even though it's beginning to feel like this is the way it is and it's playing through or it's played through, now we got to deal with it, we still got another round of this to go. This is December 26th. Now, and of course, Mercury here is the active player, and this Mercury is stirring up events then that actually are replaying stuff that began back around Election Day or the week after Election Day, November 12th through the 18th, when Mercury at that time was squaring Saturn, semi-squaring Pluto, opposing Jupiter, sesqui-squaring Mars, and then the very end of November, first week of December, when that same series was played backwards and Mercury was sesqui-squaring Mars, a complicated scenario about what we say versus what we are doing. Mercury opposing Jupiter, saying too much again. Mercury, that would be on December 4th. Mercury semi-squaring Pluto again on December 5th. Things are not right, angry words, things are coming out in the open and there's conflict, and then the dealing with reality on December 6th. Now, We're getting that exact same play for the third and final time as Mercury square Saturn on the 26th, opposes Jupiter on the 26th, then semi-squares Pluto on the 28th, and sesqui-squares Mars on the 29th, as Mars is coming into its exact opposition, the second of three oppositions to Pluto on January 3rd. And of course, that third and final opposition will be on April 27th. Complicated times. The deal is not done. Things are not yet set in stone. This is December 26th. On December 27th, we have the moon moving into Sagittarius at 11:46 a.m. Here at noon, you can see that it's just 0 degrees of Sagittarius. And this, I think, again, takes a little bit of pressure off. We still have Mercury very closely square Saturn. I mean, at noon, that Mercury square to Saturn is still about a half a degree orb. Even though it's separating, it's already past its exactness. The Jupiter square Saturn is still also about a half a degree from being exact, but it's also past its exactness. On top of that, we have Venus making a half square with Uranus, and that Venus making a square with Uranus, and that Venus square to Uranus is exact at 11:41 p.m. So we're coming into that all day. It's not exact until later this evening, near midnight on Friday the 27th. And this can be, on one hand, excitement. It can be an expression of Venus, of love, of pleasure that is out of the box, extraordinary, but it can also be a bit unsettling because the energy is a bit awry. It's not stable. But on the other hand, it certainly can feel very exciting. And remember that Venus is also, aside from that square to Uranus, that Venus has recently sextiled Chiron. I don't think we mentioned that. That was back on the 23rd, and there's some potential for healing then. I may have mentioned that or not. It's a sextile. But the other thing is that Venus is also coming into a sextile with Eris. That's exact tomorrow. And although Eris can be a bit disruptive, it also is interested in making healing at a higher level. And so this Venus energy and Venus is moving through Aquarius, where it's a bit, it's idealized, but not emotionally idealized. It's more conceptual. It's about the nature of equality in relationships that has to do with equanimity and true friendship, rather than the old paradigm of relationship of male-female ownership, dominance and possessiveness and submission. That Venus in Aquarius seeks equality. But Venus is quite active here on the 27th. And on top of that, the moon moving into Sagittarius is also taking some pressure off of the still pending, looming opposition between Mars and Pluto, because the moon is going to be making a sextile to Pluto as it moves into Sagittarius. And then a few hours later, later in the evening, the moon will be making a trine to Mars. And I think that this does help take a little bit of the pressure off of what otherwise could be a still fairly complicated sequence of events. That is December 27th. Now, on the 28th, we have Mercury still in play. Remember, Mercury has made its opposition to Jupiter, and it's square to Saturn. And yet here on the 28th, Mercury is making a half square for the third and final time to Pluto. Again, these are words that can come out that are very deep. They can be complicating, but they have to do with expressing things that are hidden, that are coming out into the open. This can be very profound, very powerful. It depends how we work with it, though. And because the moon is in Sagittarius and will be aligning with Mercury, moon conjunct Mercury actually occurs at 7 p.m. on the 28th. That gives us an ability to say how we feel. And in fact, the moon here is also going to be opposing Jupiter and squaring Saturn, and it'll be trining Chiron and Eris. This is a very powerful day of communication. And where big ideas and hopes, the long distance ideas, whether it's long distance travel or just big thinking about possibilities, I think that moon in Sagittarius helps us, but it keeps running up against overstating things, its opposition to Jupiter, and having to deal with the reality of what is, and that would be its square to Saturn. This is all on December 28th. Now, the other thing that's been going on is that Chiron, one of the last retrograde holdouts, Chiron has actually been stationing, giving it more power, and Chiron turns direct on the 29th. Now, when slower moving planets station, turn retrograde or direct, it really gives them more power for several days around it, sometimes even a week or so, because they're moving so slowly. Chiron at 19 degrees of Aries, though, will on the 29th be trined by, it will be trined early in the day by the moon. The moon's trine to Chiron actually is just past midnight on Sunday the 29th. But we also have Mercury coming into a trine with Chiron that's exact tomorrow on the 30th. So we have some really strong potential here for healing if we take the risk of expressing the truth without making it an opinion, without making it a judgment. We can get beyond those things that separate us, and that can be quite important. It's easy, however, to fall into an argument because Mercury, making a square and a half with Mars, also has the potential of stirring up some sort of ego conflict that really may ultimately have nothing to do with anything at all. And so it's just important to make sure that as Mars is moving closer and closer to its opposition to Pluto, here on the 29th, you can see that Mars's opposition to Pluto is down to about a degree and a half, with Pluto at 1 degree of Aquarius and Mars at about 2.5 degrees of Leo, opposite sign of Aquarius. And so Mercury is really stirring things up, but it can also create action, and it can create the motivation to do something about those things that may not be working. That's on the 29th, and we also have the moon moving into Capricorn later in the day at actually evening time in Seattle, 8:37 p.m. Pacific time, and we can see that the moon is moving toward a new moon, and we will get to that new moon in just a moment. But the other thing that's also occurring here on the 29th is that the sun is making a square and a half with Uranus. Again, the excitement, the disruption, the newness, the potential for change, the desire to act outside of the box, not necessarily because we want to, but because we have to. Why do I say that? Because Uranus, the planet of sudden change, explosive change, of release of tension in Taurus, doesn't like to change easily. And as the sun in very stable or stability-seeking Capricorn is seeking order, but the sun and Uranus are actually in a bit of a conflict right now. And so there's this potential for change that ultimately can be very positive, but may be a little bit complex or difficult at first. That is the 29th. As we look at the 30th, The new moon in Capricorn occurs at 2:26 p.m. And looking at that new moon chart, we can see, I think, a couple of very important things. First of all, we can see how close that Mercury is to trining Chiron, which is still barely moving. The exact trine between Mercury and Chiron occurs later this evening at 11:41 p.m., whereas the new moon occurs at 2:26 p.m. Pacific Standard Time at 9 degrees and about 44 minutes of Capricorn. It's important that this new moon is not strongly aspecting anything. There's a little bit of tension from half squares and squares and a half, but they're not very strong, and there's no very close aspects that are either conjunctions, oppositions, trines, sextiles, or squares. However, there are two aspects that are significantly important. One of them is that Mercury's trine to Chiron is giving us the ability to talk about our hopes and dreams, our New Year's resolutions in ways that don't necessarily have to blame someone else for what we are not receiving or what seems to be out of reach. In other words, the healing mechanism of Chiron in Aries is about stepping into new territory. And with that Mercury in Sagittarius, the ability to go to that place that's hopeful, that has great potential. Now, there is a caveat here, and that is that Jupiter in Gemini saying we can make anything happen. This is good, that's good, everything's good, it's going to be okay. When in fact it's not, because Jupiter is still squaring Saturn. And although that aspect is separating now, the Jupiter to Saturn is over 1 degree of orb from being exact, it's still there. And we can still feel that we're not just able to build new structures with that new moon in Capricorn. We're not just able to make a plan and execute it, because the plans that we're making are still likely to be too big and too much, and we have to take it inch by inch by inch by inch. That's one thing. The second thing is now on December 30th, at the new moon, we can see that Mars opposing Pluto is now 1.25 degrees of orb from being exact. That is very, very close. And so we can feel the tension of the show, of the anger and the boundary setting and the revenge and the combativeness and the assertion, even the aggression of the show of Mars in Leo that's opposing the deeper transformation that is just beginning to occur. And I say just beginning to occur, I'm talking about the 20-year process of Pluto regenerating everything that we know about community, about conceptualization of humanity. Pluto in Aquarius is, in some ways, it's the last throes of the old, of things I think as big as capitalism, as a colonialism, patriarchy. These are huge concepts that for many people are just concepts. And for many people, there are concepts that are so strong they don't even see them. And for many people, they're so strong they can't even imagine them ever not being or what would replace them. And this is what we're getting to invent here. But I think that the dynamic of this power play that was nearly exact on election day is nearly exact already here on New Year's Eve day. Is there such a holiday? I made a new one up. But at this new moon, we're really feeling this energy. It's interesting because although the new moon itself is not strongly aspected, there's a lot going on and things that we really need to pay attention to. As we move to the last day of the year, Again, there's not a lot of direct or exact aspects. However, we can see now that Mars at 1 degree 58 minutes and Pluto at 1 degree 4 minutes are in opposition, and they are now less than 1 degree to being exact. The moon is still in Capricorn, but it's kind of an in-between day. And even as we move to the 1st of January, we can see that the moon moves into Aquarius, leaving Capricorn. And this represents a fractal microcosm of Pluto having moved from Capricorn into Aquarius. Now, as the moon does the same, it highlights its conjunction with Pluto, and the moon-Pluto conjunction is exact on January 1st at 4:44 a.m., and it's opposed Mars exactly at 5:53 a.m. So the moon on January 1st is going to be highlighting this Mars opposition to Pluto, even though the Mars opposition Pluto is not exact for another couple of days. We're going to be feeling this now in a major, major kind of way, and I think things are going to already be unfolding here. I'm sure I'll have more to say about this in the January forecast, and certainly on the astrology night on January 3rd. That will be live streamed and available for those who can't attend, either in person or can't attend the live stream. All of this is hugely significant, and I want to just bring this ahead one more day. And we can see that the moon moving through Aquarius by January 3rd, by January 2nd, noon, we can see that the Mars opposition Pluto is now 1 degree 7 minutes, 1 degree 18 minutes. It's like 11 minutes, which is like it's like about 1/6 of a degree from being exact. And by noon on January 3rd, that opposition is already exact, and it's already separating. It's already now about about 1/6 of a, it's actually 1/5 of a degree from being exact. The actual opposition occurs very late on the night of the January 2nd or early in the morning on the 3rd. But we can see how that Mars opposes Pluto, how that becomes a perfected aspect. And even though it doesn't occur to January, it's a statement for the entire year because it's so exact, so close to January 1st. It's a statement at the new moon, and I think it's going to be with us until it plays through. And remember that that third and final Mars opposition to Pluto occurs at the end of April 27th of 2025. So that's it. I hope that this was worth waiting for. And for those of you who would like things to be closer to a calendar, my mid-month normally comes out usually around the 16th or 17th, toward the middle of the month, but a couple of days after usually. This one was later, again, because I was traveling, but I hope that this was a bit different because we really did spend some time understanding not just the last week or weeks of the month, but understanding it in light of a bigger picture. There's still a lot of rock and roll ahead, and I think it's really important that we remember how important it is to act in a very local manner, spreading kindness, spreading compassion. Things are complicated out there. Things are difficult. It doesn't matter what side of what political or what political spectrum you're on, or what religious spectrum you're on, or what spectrum you're on when it comes to any one of so many different beliefs. What matters now is that we figure out a way to get through this together, because divided, we will fall. And make no mistake about it, there is an intention that is coming from the very top to give us the illusion that we are against each other in so many different ways that are out of our control. And as long as person A and person B are fighting, as long as this group is against that group, as long as we think that there's not a way for us all to be happy, we're going to be fighting against each other instead of fighting for what we all want. And what do we all want? We just want to be happy. We want to be safe. We want to be able to afford living a life that brings us some element of contentment or of accomplishment. And I think it's really important, especially during this holiday season, especially during the time of looking forward into a new year, during this time to get above our differences. I don't care how great these differences are. There are commonalities of what we want in the future. We may think that we have to act very differently to get there, but as long as we're person A against person B, as long as we're black against white, as long as we're Republican against Democrat, as long as we're against medical autonomy versus government control, whether we're for this issue or that issue, at this point in time, that's going to make less and less matter. What's going to matter more and more and more is how are we going to get along? And part of that begins with finding a place in our heart where we can smile at someone else, even if they are in a very different place. Finding a place where we can look for commonality. Finding a place of compassion, of understanding why someone might feel the way they do, even though they feel very differently than the way I feel or you feel. It's so important for us to use this astrology to go out into the cosmos as far as we can, to think cosmically, but act locally. That's it for now. I wish you all a safe and holy and magical and growth-oriented holiday season, however you might find that. And I wish us all, not just you and not just you and not just me, but all of us, because we are all in this together. I wish us all a safe and happy holiday season. That's it for now. See you all next year.